Welcome back, everybody. So I want to build off of the video that we did last time, which is about how to see green flags when you're applying for a postdoc position. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. But one of the things that we talked about in that video is the ability to talk directly with a postdoc or postdocs in that lab without the PI's interference. And that kind of transparency means that there's probably a good culture within the lab. And somebody in the comment section asked a really good question that I think we should follow up with a video, which is exactly what kinds of things should you be asking postdocs? So you're interviewing for a lab, you're interested in that lab, and you're gonna get the chance to talk with a postdoc. And obviously they're gonna ask you questions about your research and your interests and that kind of stuff, but you're gonna also be able to get the opportunity to ask them questions. And so what kinds of things should you be doing or asking of those postdocs? So I think that what we could do is run through a few questions that I would ask, and then what I'll do is tell you the question and then kind of what kinds of answers I'll be looking for, or I would be looking for, based on those questions. So I think the first question I would ask is just a general question. How do you feel about the lab, and do you think it was a good decision to come here? Okay, so it's a two-part question. How do you feel about the lab, and do you think it was a good decision for you to join this lab? So the general feel is gonna be somewhere between I hate it and I love it. It'll be somewhere in the middle. There may be people that really do honestly love being in that lab. I know that I was asked the same question and I said when I was a postdoc, yeah, I love being in this lab. But the other part of the question is actually the more important one, and is, do you think it was a good decision to come here? Because you could really enjoy being in the lab, but then honestly look back and say, you know what, I probably would have had more success somewhere else. Or, I kind of don't like it all the time, but in the end of the day, I think this is gonna set me up better than if I went to X, Y, or Z lab. And so what I'm really looking for is someone that, one, does it, at least somewhat enjoy their time in the lab. But then what I'm looking for really is somebody that says, you know what, this was the best decision that I made coming to this lab. And I think that it's really gonna be setting me up well for the future. If you hear somebody say, yeah, it's a fine coming here, but I think I would have been just as good off if I was in a different lab, maybe that's a red flag that, this lab isn't really gonna give you the best opportunity. So that's one question I would ask. Another question I would ask is, how much intellectual freedom do you have in determining your projects? And the answer that I'm looking for is something of a mixture. I don't think that you want to be in a lab where you have total intellectual freedom and you could just run around doing whatever you want. There needs to be some sort of structure to the lab, particularly for a more junior postdoc. As you become more senior, you should be getting more responsibility. But you also don't want somebody to answer that there's no freedom and that you're basically told this is your project and you don't really get any say in what you're doing. You want something in the middle. You want an answer that's something along the lines of, when you start off, you're going to be given a project, and as you build, you're going to get freedom to have input in the decision making, and as you progress, you're eventually going to be able to start building your own projects. That's something that I think most people would agree is appropriate for a postdoc. So that's something that you really want to hear. Another thing you want to hear is, or ask is, as you become more senior and you're thinking of leaving, do you know if the PI is willing to let you take projects with them? Now, this is something you should also directly ask the PI you're interested in, but it's interesting to hear what the postdocs have to say as well. Don't forget, when you're a postdoc in the lab, you're very much aware of how much your PI is going to be competing with their previous postdocs and what they're letting their postdocs take with them or not take with them. And so it's very interesting to hear, because sometimes what you'll hear is you'll ask a PI, you'll say like, will you compete with your postdocs or let them take stuff with, and they're like, oh yeah, we do. And then you talk to one of the postdocs and they'll say, well, they let them take this little minuscule part of a project, but the bulk of the work has stayed in the lab, and actually, Joe Smith in the lab is actually working on it right now. So they don't really let you take it with them. So it's interesting to hear that. And the answer that you're really looking for is that yeah, actually, there have been projects that we've proposed and they've actually said, no, we shouldn't do that because it directly competes with Jane Doe, who's a former postdoc in the lab, and I don't want to compete with them. Something like that is exactly what you want to hear. Another thing you want to hear is just what is the turnover rate of postdocs in the lab? And again, this is something that you can ask the PI, is kind of generally how long are people staying in the lab. But again, same as the last question, it's interesting to hear from postdocs because, you know, sometimes there may be a little discrepancy in what the PI says versus the postdoc. And you want to hear that, you know, there's you know, roughly, you know, X amount of postdocs and they stay for at least 3 years. You know, that's really good. If they're staying for less than 3 years, you know, that may not be a problem, but it may be a problem if it's a continual thing, that it's like a revolving door and you constantly have new postdocs coming in every 12 months. You know, that could be an issue. Normally, you want postdocs that are there for at least 3 years. And then another question that you could be asking is, you know, generally, how do you get along with the PI and how are your one-on-ones? And the answer that you want is that we get along pretty well. We have our disagreements, but we're always able to come to some kind of a conclusion. Or you want to hear that I really love this PI, like I think that they're the best and I love working for them. That I want to work hard to make them happy, that I think they have my best career development in mind, which is another question you could ask is you know, do they support your career development? But along the lines of how are one-on-ones with them, it's important to know, you know, it's one thing in a broader picture to get along with your PI. It's one thing in a big group setting to get along with your PI. It's another when it's the two of you one-on-one, nobody else around. How do the two of you get along and how do you interact? And you could really learn a lot about somebody and how they are when you have a one-on-one interaction with them. And sometimes PIs are okay, and then as soon as you get into that one-on-one situation, they just, you know, they hammer you and it's just not a pleasant experience. So asking about that. And I think, you know, one last one that you could ask is, you know, would you, if you could do it again, would you pick this lab again? You know, and this builds off of a question that we talked about earlier is, you know, do you think it was a good decision to come here? But would you pick this again? You know, now that you've gone through and you know what you know, would you pick this lab again, or would you pick, you know, Professor X down the hall? Do you think that's a better opportunity for you? And obviously the answer you're looking for is, well, of course I would pick this lab again. Like, you know, I know what these other labs are doing and they're doing great work, but I think this is really where I'm able to succeed. And these are just some of the questions I think that you could ask. There's obviously a ton more questions, and I could probably go on for an hour giving you suggestions, but I really want to try to keep this shorter and concise and give you, you know, 5 or so good questions that I think that you could ask that really are going to give you a view of, you know, what life is really like in that lab. Because it's one thing to hear from the PI, but it's another to hear from the postdocs, and it's very important to hear from them, right? Because you're going to be in their shoes. So if the PI paints the lab as a rosy, beautiful place and all the postdocs are cold and stiff and, you know, they're not happy there, that's going to be you in another year. So you need to be mindful of that and really take to heart what they say. So I think we'll wrap it up here. You know, if you guys have any questions, you know, leave them in the comments. If there's any specific questions you're thinking about asking, leave them in the comments and maybe we could discuss, you know, what would be good or bad answers to hear. If you have other ideas of videos that you would like for me to make, also leave those down below. And I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye.